Welcome back, everyone. I'm Mariquita Solis, the Uncaged Heart Coach. This show is dedicated to the successful man on paper who has it all: the career, the house, the financial security, but who knows deep down inside he's fighting a soul war. He's ready to end that hollow silence of the man box and finally build a life of genuine courage, purpose, and authenticity. I bring a unique I bring a unique approach, so unique I can't even say it, built on years of training from the Institute for Women-Centered Coaching, Training, and Leadership. This is combined with my direct social work experience with little boys shutting down their feelings, giving me insight into the exact moment the successful, driven man of today started building those walls. As an empath and a highly sensitive coach, I help men reconnect with the very things they were told to shut down: their vulnerability, their compassion, and their somatic system. So today we're looking at a system failure that affects almost every man in our society, but one that we rarely have the data to explain. We often talk about the man mask that stoic, disconnected performance men put on to survive. But where's the original code for that mask written? So today, I'm excited that you're joining. We're going to talk about getting back to that beginning. We're going to talk about the architecture of boyhood and understand how our natural human capacity for connection is traded for a survival system. So I'm deeply honored today to be joined by Dr. Judy Y. Chu. Dr. Chu is an educator, researcher, author, and advisor. She's taught a course on boys psychosocial development at Stanford University since 2003. Her research highlights boys' relational strengths and how boys' gender socialization can impact their development, relationships, and well being. She is the author of When Boys Become Boys: Development, Relationships, and Masculinity, and co editor of Adolescent Boys: Exploring Diverse Cultures of Boyhood. Her work has been cited in the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN Digital, Newsweek, and Time. She previously served as chair of the Movember's Global Men's Health Advisory Committee, co-chair of Equimundo's board of directors, and on the board of directors of the Partnership for Male Youth. She currently serves on the board of directors of Roots of Empathy and Build Up Boys, advisory committee for the Foundation for Positive Masculinity, professional advisory council for Boys Club of New York, an expert advisory group for NextGenMen. Judy, thank you so much for joining us to help with this commonplace sadness that's going around in our world, the way that we treat young men and how we can do better for our young men.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, wonderful. And thanks everyone for watching. I see JJ's here. Let us know where you're joining from. So I think this boils down to prioritizing our own truth over fiction, and fiction being that of someone who we're not. So we're going to be talking today and finding the way back to the path that is our integrative self, right? Who we really are at our core. So we're talking about human engineering to dismantle this mask and this man box and come back into who we are. So I read your book, Judy. I have it right here, When Boys Become Boys, and I was fascinated with it. And I don't know if you can see it because of the way this darn StreamYard is, but nevertheless, I have it. And I've seen your document and your work in documentaries, and it really called out to me. So, and I've had conversations with people about young boys. So this is just really on my heart. My heart goes out to all the little boys that might be wounded. I feel it right now in my stomach. Wounded by the shutdown of feelings, and just not allowing them to be who they are. So your research found that boys are born with the innate relational capacities, and many people say that they're different than girls. However, I want to talk to you about this. Our society also says that is telling us the opposite. So can you share tangible evidence that shows how little boys are treated differently than little girls, starting as early infancy, and how that signals to them that they need to be tougher?
Okay. Yeah. So I think before we look into kind of differences in children's socialization experiences, we want to start with the infant studies that were, conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, for instance, by Colwyn Trevarthen and Ed Tronick and Murray, and these really renowned infant researchers who found that, and Daniel Stern, sorry, I could list everybody, but but basically they found that, regardless of gender, most humans are born into relationships, into interpersonal relationships, with a fundamental capacity and a primary desire to connect in kind of mutual, responsive, close, caring, emotionally intimate relationships. So in the beginning, we all have this desire for connection, and not just any connection, like positive reinforcing connection, but authentic connection. And some of the example, I can give you two examples of what the infant researchers found as evidence to support this. And one was a study with 2-month-olds, and this was Murray and Trevarthen. And they had set up an infant and their caregiver, and they rotated between, fathers, mothers, or, a primary caregiver, and they had them face to face, but engaging by on video. And so they weren't actually, so basically they were interacting in real time, but they were looking at each other on screens. And then what they did was they could then manipulate it, like pause it and replay certain things. And so the infant obviously responded really well when they were in real time and in sync and everything. But then what they would do is they would replay a portion that was still positive. It was still the caregiver giving very positive support, encouraging feedback, but the infants could tell that it was not in sync, and that would upset the infant. So first of all, what those studies showed was first that the infants are active participants in these they have emotions, they're engaging, they're actively involved in that interaction and relationship. And also that they don't just want things to be positive, they want things to feel real, to be appropriate and in sync. And so that was one of the studies that really stood out. Another one was Ed Tronick's study with Catherine Weinberg, and they looked at 3-month-olds. And you can Google this. If you Google still face experiment, Ed Tronick, you can see like a 2 or 3 minute video of this happening. And what they did was this time they're in the room together, a caregiver and their baby. And what they do is they have them interact, and they're, very engaged and happy, and everything's going on. And then they ask the caregiver to please present a still face, kind of similar to what you might find in a depressed parent, someone who is there physically, but not kind of able to be present emotionally. And again, the infants detect it. They try to re-engage the caregiver, try and give the same signals that had gotten them a positive response just seconds earlier. They try it again. And then when it doesn't work, they become very dysregulated and very upset. So again, it's not just having a person present. It's not just having a person engaged, but they are attuned. It comes down to, we crave connection, and not just any connection, but authentic connection. And so if we understand that that's how human beings are born into this world, that's where we start out, that gives us a slightly different take on what happens then when we put boys especially, but these days almost any gender is taught to strive towards kind of masculine qualities, because masculine qualities are the ones that our society tends to value, for instance, over feminine qualities. And so anyone who wants to be successful or have an advantage in this world learns that they need to display these qualities that our society has gendered masculine. And so when we put but I'm going to talk about boys just because it's easier than kind of naming everyone who's affected. But like when we put boys on this trajectory that says you need to, first of all, the overarching directive is you need to prove your masculinity and thereby your social worth. And so it's not this, it's the exact opposite of what Mr. Rogers tells his kids, that I like you just the way you are, which is so freeing, because then it allows individuals to discover what that means, like who are they and how can they best be themselves and contribute to the world in their unique ways and through their unique talents. But instead, we tell kids early on, or especially boys, that they need to prove that they are real boys, or eventually down the line that they are real men, right? And then secondly, that they need to prove this by adhering to a strict code of masculine behavior, what some people refer to as the man box, like this kind of hegemonic masculine image that says boys need to be physically tough and emotionally kind of indifferent or stoic and non-expressive, or they can express anger, but they can't express, sadness or fear or any sort of vulnerable or soft emotion, and that they need to be always self-sufficient, like you can't ask anyone for help or reveal any sort of like need or neediness, because this kind of thing, dependency on other people, is regarded as feminine and therefore a weakness and a liability for boys and men. So what does, again, the infant studies cast a new light on what does their development and socialization look like when we start with the understanding that this is not their natural state. Their natural state is to connect. And in infancy, it's crucial to their survival. Like babies literally need people to help, need to be able to elicit care in order to survive. But I would argue that throughout the life course, and there's a lot of research evidence to support this, that throughout the life course, we all need relationships. No one succeeds alone. We all need to lean on and rely on other people, ask for help, get, and also, receive help and give help is a part of what gives our lives meaning and a sense of importance and a sense of efficacy. And so what's kind of are the implications of putting boys and men on a developmental trajectory that says you need to act like you don't need anyone. You can't ever reach out. You can't ever admit your vulnerabilities, your uncertainties, your anxieties. Basically, we ask them to shut down a part of their humanity that is really essential, not only to their mental health, but also to their physical health. And there's plenty of research and a lot of discussions about loneliness and the implications of social isolation, especially for men and boys, because even though there are all, people of all genders do struggle with loneliness and isolation, the social prescription to man up is targeted more directly at boys and men. And so it definitely puts them at a disadvantage in terms of being able to take care of themselves and the people they love without feeling this kind of sense of shame that came from their socialization that told them, no, a real man doesn't do that. A real man stands on his own and doesn't need anyone and doesn't care too much about relationships because that would be unmanly. And basically what it comes down to is that hurts boys and men. It hurts boys and men because the truth is we all need relationships. We are relational beings, and that, in order to thrive and to be healthy and happy individuals in and of ourselves, and also in the context of our relationships to family and friends in our communities, we need to really draw on the full range of our human qualities and skills and interests and commitments. A commitment to really being connected to ourselves, that is preserving our sense of integrity, like here I am, this is what it means to be authentic and whole for me, and then connected to other people, which is to be in relationship in a way where you feel like you can say and think what you really feel, and that the people will not shame you and abandon you as a result of you showing who you really are.
Yes, and I thought about when you were speaking about that, this independent. I mean, we have that with women. So I worked with women also, and this, I'm independent. I don't need you. And then the other side is saying the same thing. And how are we ever going to have come together if we're not taught as little children? We need each other, and if that's not something that is praised and well, I could go on all day about that. But so what age groups do you work with now, Judy?
Well, my research focused on, I started out studying adolescent boys, ages 12 to 18, and I eventually also studied boys at ages 4 to 6. And the way that happened was that I was actually led to study boys by boys themselves. And the story I usually convey to people is that after my first year of graduate school, I went home that summer and I was chauffeuring my 13-year-old brother and his friends around town. And I usually need to add that it's a diverse group of boys. People always assume that they're all Asian, but actually, other than my brother, none of them were Asian. So I wanted to add that note. But then, and one of his friends said to me, oh, Harvard, what are you learning there? And I said, well, I met this really interesting woman named Carol Gilligan, and she's done these studies of girls that have really impacted how people view and try to support girls' healthy development. And he's like, yes, I know everybody's worried about girls, and it's great that they're paying attention to girls and supporting them. He's all for that. He said, but you know what? There's stuff going on for boys too. We have challenges and struggles and things that are going on for us, and nobody's talking to us. And he said, I know, you should study boys. you can start with me. And so I kind of didn't know what to do with it at the time, but when I returned to Harvard and that fall I was taking, classes with Carol, including a clinical interviewing class, and she says, it sounds like this boy, these boys have something to say. Why don't you go and interview them for the assignments for the class? And so I did exactly that, and that was how I came to study boys and their relationships and their experiences and what's going on in their lives, what's important for them, what questions they have and concerns, and where they draw strength from, but also where they feel challenged or pressure. And what I was hearing from them was that they were coming up against this kind of choice, because they said, there's the way that other people see them, which is very informed by stereotypes. Oh, boys are just this. Even when I would tell people that I study adolescent boys, they're like, oh, I'm so sorry for you. They're the worst. And I'm like, that's awful, because those assumptions and stereotypes, that trickles down to the boys, and they feel it. They feel that people see them that way. And then so the boys would then say, so there's that, the expectation, the societal assumptions and expectations, but then there's also how they experience themselves to be. And it wasn't, and most of the time it wasn't nearly that bad, right? It was like, oh, well, I also, I love animals, or I really love my family, or I really care about my friends. And that narrative or that portrayal of boys was often overshadowed by the stereotypes. And what they were struggling with was, it's like, is that gap between the way boys are said to be and the way we experience ourselves to be, is that just the way things are? And is development or growing up, becoming mature, is it just a matter of accepting that people are never going to see me for who I really am? And so and it wasn't that they had, completely concluded that they would never be able to be seen, but they were already kind of like saying, okay, well, it just seems like, demonstrating that y'all grown up means not struggling with that discrepancy between, and just kind of accepting that people just aren't going to know who you are. And so when I was, supervised by Carol and brought this question to her, she said, well, you know what? I think you need to start earlier. I think you need to look at when boys are really coming up against that and really kind of fighting it. Like they don't like, so her hypothesis, her focus had been on early adolescence and girls at earlier adolescence. And she said that she felt that the kind of conflict and struggle that girls were experiencing at early adolescence as they begin to look like young women, because girls in general are allowed to be tomboys. And sometimes that's even valued in some cultures, like girls can do climb trees and, exhibit masculine traits. And maybe some people don't love it, but at least in American culture, girls are encouraged, right, to be strong, to show that they're tough too, that they can do it too. So anyway, so she was saying that with girls, the struggle tends to happen around early adolescence. Her hypothesis was that because boys are more important to preserving patriarchal values, that patriarchy kind of goes after boys first. And I know that kind of it's a caricature, but what happens is that if you look at just the messages, again, girls are allowed to be tomboys until they begin to look like young women because of their sexual development at adolescence. Then they're expected to be good girls or good women or perfect girls or the nice girl, and they're supposed to act like young ladies, and they came up against that, and there was a healthy resistance against those kinds of impositions of societal expectations, the mask, as you say, to kind of portray themselves in a way that is more aligned with societal stereotypes of what a good woman or girl looks like. For the boys, those messages come in earlier. So don't be a sissy, don't be a mama's boy. Those things come in during early childhood. A boy who cries, and if it's 3 or 4 years old, of course he cries. He falls down and he cries, and he's shamed for it because he showed himself to be vulnerable. And that doesn't make any sense, because of course, that's how they communicate what's going on with them. I've even heard, like at the zoo, my husband and I were at the zoo with our son, and I heard someone tell a baby who couldn't have been more than 1 year old, don't you know boys don't cry? And I'm like, that's how infants communicate their needs. I don't know what you're asking of them when you tell a baby or a child or even a man that they're not supposed to cry when they feel hurt. Because of course, as humans, we are emotionally vulnerable and physically vulnerable. When we experience physical pain, it hurts. When we have our hearts broken or we lose somebody we care about, that hurts. And so to deny boys and men the opportunity to acknowledge, at least to themselves, that they're feeling these things is incredibly not good. It's detrimental to their own kind of sense of that their feelings are valid, that of course they're experiencing something that is normal within the human condition, and that denying that doesn't really serve them well. It doesn't serve them well ultimately. But I'm sorry, I think I digressed. I think we were talking about
I
the boy
think
study
it's all good.
and the boy. We were looking at the boys. So, so I did study the younger boys, and what I ended up kind of stumbling on or being really privileged to observe is this moment of transition where the 4-year-old boys, when I first met them, were just so, wore their hearts on their sleeves. You know what I mean? Like they would say and think exactly what they were saying and thinking. You didn't have to second guess them. They were exuberant. They were kind of in their space. They could, be kind of cautious and distrustful if you were new to them. But then once they figured out they could trust you, then they were totally open and really, exuberant. And so it's, and then watching them learn through their interactions, with adults and also with each other. And they had formed something called the mean team, which was basically a metaphor for, their socialization towards patriarchal norms of masculinity. And this mean team had these rules. And so boys couldn't play with dolls. Boys couldn't be friends with girls. Boys couldn't cry, if they got hurt, you had to toughen up. And so they were hearing these rules. And as they learned those rules, they went from being really kind of authentic and direct and articulate and attentive in their relationships to acting in ways that made them appear inauthentic, indirect, inarticulate, and inattentive. So it's not that they became those things. It's not that they lost their relational capabilities, but that they learned to put on a mask or project an image that was more aligned with societal stereotypes about what a real boy should look like.
That's very interesting. Yes, because people have told me that boys are just different than girls. They don't feel as much. So it is there. We know it's there. So it's a matter of society defining their roles and them doing their best to fit in. Is that correct?
Right. I think even like with Catherine Weinberg's work with Ed Tronick and the infant studies, there were very small samples and it hasn't been tested more broadly, but if there were gender differences in those particular samples, they found that, like the stereotype that, oh, well, girls need other people to help them regulate. It was actually the boy babies who were more reliant on their caregivers to kind of bring their emotions back into. So again, gender differences are tricky. And so I don't want to claim like, oh, boys do this and girls do that. But we can say, and there are lots of examples of, how parents view and respond to a crying baby if they think it's a boy versus if they think it's a girl. They're quicker to soothe and pick up and comfort girls than they do boys. They're more tolerant of kind of risk-taking behaviors with boys than they are with girls. And so there are differences in how people view and respond to babies, to boys and girls, but there's not so much an inherent inborn desire. There's more individual differences within each gender than there are differences between genders.
Very interesting. All right. So I have a question here from Frank. Thanks for watching, Frank. Are there commonly identified effects on a boy's development based on the type of exposure they had to negative masculine behaviors from their fathers, a stoic, disconnected dad versus a violent dad?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that. I think absolutely parents, both, all the adults in kids' lives, but also especially parents, they leave a very strong impression and impact on kids. And so when the fathers can, for instance, model a range of behaviors and qualities, the boys say, see, that's what's possible. That's how it's possible for a boy or man to be. And conversely, when fathers shut those things down, it doesn't it doesn't prevent the boy from ever becoming in touch with those things, but it definitely makes it harder because they see it as like, well, this is how my dad, someone I admire and look up to, or who is the model of masculinity in my world. This is how men act. And so you usually say that, boys need to see a range of adults displaying a range of human behaviors that really span what we tend to divide up into masculine and feminine, but really are, together encompass the whole human experience and the things that we need to draw on and that we regularly normally experience in our daily lives. So I guess to offer a too simplistic answer to your really thoughtful question, yes, there are negative effects of kind of feeling like, it's not okay for me to feel this. It's not okay for me to be this. And that just creates kind of a an unnecessary obstacle to, because life is hard enough as it is, those feelings in and of themselves are hard to, kind of manage and deal with. But if we're told we can't acknowledge them and we can't talk about them and that we should feel bad for even having them, I mean, that can really make it a lot more challenging than it needs to be. I mean, I always end up citing Mr. Rogers, but one of the things he said was, if it's mentionable, then it becomes manageable. And I think that boys and men especially are taught from a very early age. And it's not necessarily the father's fault, because the father probably heard, I like to assume that parents usually are trying to do their best for their kids. And it's very likely that that father was told at some point in his life too, that that was not acceptable. And so as he prepares his son to enter the world of boys and men, it's kind of a protective move to say, like, gosh, I don't want him to get bullied. I don't want him to get rejected. I don't want, horrible things to happen to them. So they need to learn this. But ultimately, it's not optimal. It's not optimal to kind of stay for the boys and for the men to stay, if they cannot stay connected to themselves and to other people, if they can't preserve and maintain those connections, it will present certain challenges ahead, further down the line.
Well, thank you, Frank, for that question. And if anybody has other questions that's watching, please let us know. And I do have a question also from someone. But so when you were working with the little boys that were in your book, the mean team, what were their thoughts about little girls? And what was it about the little girls that they didn't want to, that possibly they didn't want to be like?
Oh, goodness. I think it was more like this vague sense that boys are not supposed to be like girls. And they were learning this. This was not some innate feeling that they had, like, oh, they were born. Because before that kind of what they call the curtain of patriarchy, before those messages intensify when they enter schools and learn that, oh, we're not supposed, they play, just they're friends with the girls. In fact, one of the 4-year-olds said, I'm actually friends with all of the girls, but I don't want the boss of the mean team to find out, because then he'll fire me from his club and then I won't have a club. And that would be a bummer. So they learn very early, very astutely, that the rules of engagement are, if you want to be one of the boys and with the boys, you have to play by their rules. And one of their rules is, we are going to be, we define ourselves in opposition to the girls. Not we define it, but society tells us that boys are not. So even one of the things that they said, the mean team originally, they said, oh, we thought it could be the good team, but the girls are the nice team. The girls are good. So we have to be the mean team. And I was like, but are you mean? And they're like, not really, and do you want to be mean? Not really. But they know that there's this kind of expectation, again, that society says proving masculinity involves casting off anything that society has deemed feminine and distancing yourself from anyone who displays feminine traits. So, it's just this idea of like, that's the path to proving masculinity. And again, it comes back to this idea that they have to prove masculinity in the first place, that they're not just masculine simply because they're boys, but they have to show it, and they have to show it constantly, because it's never kind of a done deal. Like, they establish it and then everyone accepts that they're a boy. Their masculinity is precarious. And that also creates this kind of anxiety and uncertainty and mistrust, because anyone can call them out at any time. And so if they wear pink, or they like dolls, or play with dolls, or they play with the girls, and or they have long hair instead of short hair. There's these really arbitrary rules, and they can feel kind of the stress of that arbitrary, like, they didn't know that they're not supposed to play with dolls. But usually the way they learn is someone's like, you're playing with a doll, you're a girl, or you have long hair, you're a girl, you're not a boy. And so that's kind of the logic, that where the argument that plays out in their head and the way that they conclude it. So like, even when one of the boys was kind of challenging one of the mean team's rules, and he was being kind of punished for it, they said, you're a girl, you're not a boy, you're fired, and you have to go and do things all by yourself. And that actually is a very interesting thing to pay attention to, because it absolutely has to do with the rules that they're told, but what motivates them is their desire to to relate to and identify with the others. So the ultimate punishment is not really, you're a girl, although that's not anything they're hoping for. The punishment is, you have to be on your own. You don't have anybody. You don't have a club anymore. You don't have somewhere to belong. You're a misfit. And, unfortunately, our society does that in a lot of different, this whole us and them, in and out. And if you're not in and with us, then guess what? You're all on your own. And that loneliness and isolation, as we know, has very serious repercussions for, and it's a terrible, uncomfortable place for people to feel like no one will want to be with them. And that's what drives it in the first place, right? If you don't prove your masculinity, then you haven't proven your social worth, and you are therefore unlovable, and no one will want to be with you. And so, that comes with all these feelings of fear and pain and shame that men and boys then carry forward, and that impact their decisions. Because if you look throughout their lives, they actually do demonstrate a healthy resistance against those kinds of social prescriptions and impositions that really undermine their sense of integrity and hinder their close relationships. Because they continue, you can see evidence that they're always trying, within the constraints of societal expectations and stereotypes, they're constantly trying to forge meaningful connections, and they're constantly resisting disconnections. But when you see boys, for instance, acting out, and you're like, what is this? They're pushing everyone away. That is their way of pulling people in the only ways they're told boys can act. Right. And so they always say, oh, it's a cry for attention. And I really believe that it is, because as hard as they might be pushing you away, what they want is to be close. And you can even feel that when you're dealing with like kids, like let's say there was a moment of separation, like babies, like the strange situation where they say, oh, the parent walks out of the room and comes back, and the toddler or baby is angry because the parent has abandoned them. So as the parent, as they're seeking the hug, they're also pushing them away to say, I'm mad at you because I felt so bad that you tried to leave me, right? And so we see kind of variations on that theme, in adolescence and in early adulthood and in later adulthood. Oftentimes the harder we push what we're really asking for. Well, sometimes we do want our own space, but I'm just saying that there are also times when people seem to be pushing others away, and they actually wouldn't mind if others stayed nearby and showed them that, I get it. I get that this is the only course of action you think you can take. But what I see is that you're reaching out for connection because that's what we all crave and need.
Yes, and it seems like that would be very exhausting to to these little boys, and it continues on into an adulthood to always have to be on guard. To be threatened like you are not a man. It just seems like it would be you're walking on thin ice, right? And then, I've had men come to me and say I was vulnerable with women, but then they used it against me.
Right.
And so I think we have to get the word out here that I love what you said earlier before we started talking, before we went online, about we're human beings, first, right? And we all have these core needs. So it's important that we recognize that before we start boxing ourselves into places where we cannot be authentic, because it's going to come out, and it comes out in anger. With the little boys that I worked with boys that were like 4 to 18 in the residential treatment centers, and they were angry because what else could they express? That was what they were allowed to express, is anger. And they were angry, and they would let you know it. And then it was coming out, and it came out very aggressively, and they didn't like it. They couldn't control it, and they were afraid.
Naomi Way actually wrote a book last year called Rebels with a Cause, and to kind of address, again, the venues we allow, the strategies that we allow boys and men to use are often strategies that are not socially appealing, socially attractive, but it's what they know that they can get angry, but they can't get sad. And so when they're sad, what do? We see anger. And that's one of the reasons why, depression, for instance, is often unrecognized or not as well recognized when it manifests in boys and men, is because it comes across as anger instead of like that. And a lot of, like, for instance, old school depression inventories will say, oh, well, this is how we're going to assess depression. How often are you crying? How often are you weeping on your own? And that it's like, if they say, well, we're not doing that, then like, oh, well, then you're not depressed. But the thing is, the anger is manifesting. The depression, the sadness is manifesting in different ways, because that was what they were told and socialized to do early on is to channel those feelings in ways that are more socially appropriate.
Yes, and that's why
Socially
we have.
appropriate, but not desirable, obviously. I mean, anger and violence are not desirable behaviors, but they're considered gender appropriate. So,
yeah, and we have to watch out for our young boys and our men. I mean, that we have to be able to recognize this. So JJ's saying, sounds like this really exemplifies how powerful that nurture experience is when it comes to nature versus nurture.
right. Yeah, thank you for that comment. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's like it really disrupts what we might consider a natural course of development, which is one that is really centered and focused on building connections, discovering who we are, emerging as who we are in relationship to other people, and not relationships serving merely as a context for our individual development, but experiencing closeness and connection in relationships as being in it of itself a goal of healthy development and an indicator of well-being. So right now, the way, socialization towards gender norms as constructed under patriarchy, where masculinity is valued over femininity and some forms of masculinity are valued over other forms of masculinity, that really leads people away from being able to preserve the values and qualities that make them who they are and that they value most about themselves. I mean, one of the boys' fathers said, it's this ironic thing that the things that make the boys most appealing are the things that they learn to cast off in the name of being one of the boys and for the sake of being with the boys.
Yes, it is very ironic. The thing that is so beautiful about them and their expressiveness is they're learning that they have to shut it down.
Right. And as you said earlier, it's not about them, what they want or what they are trying to do, because because sometimes the solution focuses on, we just need to empower boys and tell them to go, to tell boys and men, just expression. But like you said, if they do it and they get shamed for it, then that's not a sustainable solution. And there was a Pew study in 2018 that showed that we will say we want boys and men to express their emotions, but then when they do, it makes us uncomfortable. We shame them. We tell them that's not manly, or it's just we haven't as a culture shifted our values or our norms and our practices to really support boys and men to be the full humans that we tell them they need to be, that we know is important to their health, and that we say we want them to do in our relationships with them. But then we really need to kind of ask ourselves, are we also kind of providing the support so that when they do show up in those ways, in ways that are authentic and vulnerable, that we don't then shame them and say that's not what we really wanted, because it's mean and it's not going to encourage anyone to do that. And to really it's hard. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, to really live by our values and to really align our behaviors with our beliefs, but it's worth working towards, because enough people now are struggling and suffering because they feel like they can't, if they take off the mask, then they will have no one. But then also if they wear a mask in their relationships, then, as Carol Gilligan put it, if you're not in this relationship, then who is in relationship, right? So if you wear a mask in order to have these relationships, or these quote and relationships, then it's either way you're alone. You're either without any relationships, or you're in a relationship that doesn't feel like that people really know and accept you for who you are, and that's also a lonely thing. So it's possible to have relationships and yet still feel lonely, and that's how we have set the dilemma that we have created from a nurture standpoint, is to say people have to choose, and it's an impossible choice, because either way you're alone or you're feeling lonely.
Gosh, yeah, and that really hits home for me, always faking it. I mean, throughout my life, trying to bend myself into, whatever you like, I like, right? And it was just a facade. So anyway, thankfully that's over. So so I want to talk about this. So there's in the father-son dynamic, some fathers feel rejected because they don't know how, they're having problems relating to their sons, right? Their sons want to be on the internet and the screens, and the sons don't want to connect, and the fathers don't know how to bring that back. And I feel like, sometimes that there's a language gap here, right? Where the father might be very logical, and really the son is wanting that authentic presence. Now, what about a teenage son? How can a father get that connection back with his teenage son that might, they might have been grown apart, where, the emotions aren't being shown by the teenager, and the father has no idea how to get back to that presence. I mean, this presence is something that you can't hold, it's not something you can see, it's felt.
Right, right. And I think just to also make sure, and I don't think you're doing this, but I know there is sometimes in the discussion a tendency toward blame. And I just want to make sure that we're not saying, oh, fathers need to know how to do this. Because again, we tend to parent the way that we were parented. And if the fathers grew up in a generation that said, this is what boys and men are supposed to know how to do, then we turn around and say, well, you need to provide this other thing, But actually, one of the things that hopefully gives us a sense of hope about it is that it's not about the fathers or the boys learning something new or to somehow be more like girls or women, but it's really about returning them to what they were born with a capacity to do. And that's just to really be, again, to put it in simplest terms, although it's hard to do, it's easy to say, it's to kind of restore their sense of connection to themselves. And so it's kind of like that seatbelt thing, like you have to put on your, not seatbelt, the mask, you have to put on your own. You have to take care of yourself and be able to kind of be self-aware and self-accepting before you can invite someone else to be self-aware and accepting with you. And so into relationship. And so I know that, not everyone is able to, go to therapy, but therapy is one way, or talking to somebody, it's one way to really work on those issues. Again, if it's mentionable, it's manageable, it becomes manageable. And a lot of us, myself included for sure, the more we understand what we experienced that led us to the perspective and the behaviors that we tend to engage in, how we tend to do things, the more that we can reflect on that, the more we can make informed decisions about how we want to move forward. And I usually emphasize that doesn't necessarily mean we change everything, but at least we know we're conscientious about it. We're aware that we're choosing this instead of kind of doing it by autopilot. We can say, oh, I tend to do this. Is that how I want to be? Does that align with my values now? Maybe it served me in my teens, maybe it served me in my 20s, but is that how I want to show up as a parent? And so really taking those, giving yourself, being patient with yourself, having empathy and compassion for yourself, and of course, not expecting yourself to show up perfectly. And in fact, kids don't need us to show up perfectly. And in fact, they do better when we can talk to them about, gosh, this is what I'm really having trouble with. Because then it gives them permission and space when they struggle with those things to acknowledge it. Like, gosh, I don't have it all figured out yet, but I know that my parent, who's a whole adult, doesn't either. Then that, I know it seems counterintuitive because adults feel like, oh, I'm supposed to have all the answers and I'm not supposed to show up perfectly. But none of us really love it when other people are perfect. You know what I mean? We're like, oh gosh, well, it was easy for them, but I'm having a hard time. So does that mean that something's wrong with me? And so, if we can remind ourselves that we show up authentically, imperfections and all, that actually helps kids to know that they too can be imperfect, that problem solving and kind of lifelong learning, all those things, vulnerability, it's all a part of the human experience. It's kind of messy. It doesn't usually feel good to be uncertain, but the fact is a lot of us are. So why not at least acknowledge it, rather than pretending everything's fine and then forcing everyone to pretend like they're fine when none of us are. And then really thereby allowing us permission to kind of then, struggle together and to reach out when we need help, to know when we need help, to reach out, and then to offer help when we feel we can be helpful. And that doesn't mean solving anyone's problems for them, but just being there and saying, yeah, I get it. This is rough. And, but we're here, I'm here and I'm here with you, and we'll figure it out in some, and it won't always feel like this. It won't always be like this. And I think that, at least from what the kids tell me, that's what they want. They don't want a parent who steps in and is like, well, just do this. It's so easy. And I did it perfectly all along. That kind of thing doesn't usually make teens feel like opening up. But usually what a parent can do is like, I get it. It's really hard. And I'm trying to understand. And I'm very unlikely to have perfect solutions ready for you. But let's hear you out and see what it's like for you. And sometimes merely just being able to talk about it really does help. So you don't have to be a therapist, yourself to offer comfort to somebody else and support to someone else.
Right. And yeah, you're right. Exactly. This isn't only a father's issues. I mean, I have the issue in my family. I mean, where I can't compete with the computers. I mean, with young teenagers. And I'm like, I don't even know how to get to them. Right. I mean, this is very important context that you're providing for us. So we have another question here from JJ. What role does content like books, movies, and so on play in this? It would be nice to see if books and movies with these values instilled for men to be able to open up, but it tends to reinforce it.
Oh, that's another great question. So I think, obviously, yes, definitely the media, whether it's books, movies, social media, anything that they're exposed to can be an influence. But ultimately, just, again, it comes back to just because someone tells us something is something doesn't mean we automatically do it. Right. And that's the same, it applies to kids as well. Like just because someone, as a parent, for sure, you tell your kid, can you please make sure to make your bed, doesn't mean that's going to happen. Right. And so it's same thing, like they may get these messages, but ultimately they have agency to make decisions and choices for themselves. And they may be influenced by peers, by adults, and by various influences in their lives. But ultimately the decision is theirs. And so just to kind of help them break it down. Sometimes, with books or with movies or TV, if you're able to watch it with them and they say, what do you think about this? And ask, and I always have it in terms of questions. At least for me, what I found was 99% of the time, what I assumed my son was how he was making sense of something was completely not how he was making sense. It's completely my interpretation imposed on him. So what I always tried to do, definitely not perfectly, was to say, well, how are you seeing this? Like, what does this mean to you? Or I noticed in my interviews with the boys at early childhood and also the adolescent boys I'd say, I noticed this happened. I was wondering if you could tell me what you think is going on or what was going on there. And then so that, first of all, it gives them an authority over their experience and their perceptions, and it shows them that you value that. And again, that in and of itself is really important. But then it also allows them to kind of make informed decisions about like, well, do you believe it? And oftentimes, I know that, for instance, a lot of the social media influencers have been a concern for parents. They're like, oh, well, should I just cut them off? Or how do we get rid of these influencers? But if you actually talk to the boys, a lot of them say, yeah, that doesn't sound right to me, or it makes me really uncomfortable, or it's definitely not something I like. But because other people are assuming that they're just automatically buying into it, it's kind of insulting to them. And I think boys appreciate the opportunity to show people like, no, actually I'm thinking about it, and I'm not just inevitably influenced. And if they are, then ask them what that's about. Like, what does it mean to them? How are they understanding it? Everybody has different kind of definitions or perceptions. Like even like the term feminism, I usually start my class by saying, let's find out what that means, because everyone has a definition of it, but most of the time you'll find that it's not the same definition. And so asking questions about how that person's experience from their perspective, that can have a therapeutic effect for the individual. And that can be very, very kind of be a really great foundation for strengthening your relationship with them. Because again, it's about that communication. It's like, I'm interested in what you're saying. I'm curious to understand what this means to you. And that shows a certain respect, and it shows that you value their insights. And if I know that kids and adolescents really appreciate that, and it shows that the adult respects them as an individual and is there for them, and not just there to judge them or there to tell them what to do, but there to really kind of understand. One of the adolescent boys, he was a 12-year-old, he said, just having someone listen and understand and feeling like they can kind of relate, he goes, that just really comforts. And that's what they want. And that's what will kind of give your opinion as someone in their lives, like as a real person in their life, that will give your opinion more influence than something they just see or read about.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And I love that when you show up in your authentic self saying, I don't have all the answers, but let's talk about it. Your thoughts are important to me. And to have that, I mean, to establish that base when they're tiny and to always go back to it is so crucial, I think. And what a blessing it is when we're not afraid to talk, and that we have, I mean, it's up to us to be a safe space for others, for everyone, every human being, man, woman, every human being, for us to allow without judgment. We don't have to agree, but we can be kind.
Right. And I think that that point that you just mentioned is really important. It doesn't mean we, kind of spoil them by saying, "Oh, yes, your view is the only valid view." I mean, it's not. It's a mutual relationship to say, like, to be able to have disagreements and still be in relationship. It's not luckily, relationships are not like cancel culture. It's not like you say or do one wrong thing and then they throw you away. I mean, you want to show them that relationships are resilient, that human beings are resilient, that relationships, that at least your close and significant relationships, are resilient. And so there's space for differences. Or as Carol Gilligan spoke about in her book, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? She says democracy rests on differences. Like, so even if it's a relationship that it's two different people, separate entities in relationship to each other. And so it rests on differences and equality or equal voice. So the fact that you have two or more people in the relationship and that both of their perspectives or their voices are valued, have equal value. And so, and it's true for democracy. And I think it's also true for love, and love, not necessarily just romantic love, although it certainly includes romantic love, but friendship, partnership, any kind of, working relationship where you're trying to do good together and get to, achieve a goal, for the common good. That's really important, that there's that the fact that we are all as individuals unique and different from each other, but that we each have, each voice matters and each voice has value. And that can be applied, again, like I said, to relationships that involve two people or whole communities.
Oh my gosh, yes. This is so important for children to learn, that we have to talk, and that in order to, to be fulfilled successfully in life, we don't have to agree, but we have to keep that going. Or how would they even have a successful relationship if you can't do that? These are core, this is the essence of life. And we don't have to agree, but we sure do have to be respectful.
Right. Absolutely.
Yes. So tell us, like, what can parents do if they have a small boy and they are, if there's possibly, the little boy's entering kindergarten and now they want to keep him as authentic as possible, and they want him to shine in who he is. Well, how can they support that little child?
That's a wonderful question. I think it has less, I know that, as a parent, I know that, there's a lot of anxiety. Every night I'd be like, oh, I should have done this. I should have done that differently. I shouldn't have said this. And there's always this feeling like, again, this kind of perfect way of showing up, as though that would exist. And I think it really is more like, first of all, giving ourselves a break and just, doing, showing up in the best way that we can. But also, that means putting down our screens and having them put down their screens and really being present. A really great program and organization that models this is called Roots of Empathy, which I'm involved with, and it was founded by Mary Gordon. But if you look on their website, the way that it works, the way that they foster empathy in kids in elementary school, is they have a multi-month program, and they have a volunteer family bring in a baby who's usually less than 6 months old, and the kids the baby sits on a green rug, and the kids gather around, and they just have the kids observe the baby. And they said that, and in that sense alone, that kind of being still and quiet and just present with somebody, is really powerful and hard to do, because we tend to fill silences. I do it a lot myself. But just to kind of really give people, again, that kind of paying that kind of attention is a form of respect, right? And being curious and interested is so valuable. I think when someone shows you that they are curious and interested in value, I think that's one of the biggest, greatest gifts that we can give to people, is to say, you mean enough to me. I think that you're valuable enough that I'm going to give you my time, because our time is literally our lives. And so how we give our lives to people matters, and it conveys to them that they matter. But again, just kind of coming in and observing them, and they will show you. And I usually say, boys can tell you what they need if they know you're really interested. And if they don't think you are, just like if we think somebody's not really listening to us, we're not going to tell them anything real, right? And so if they know you're really interested and that you're trying, There's, I'm not saying it'll be like all of a sudden magical and everybody goes skipping through a rainbow forest or whatever. It's just, it doesn't happen in a way that sounds kind of fantastical, but it happens in a way that is truly felt and appreciated. And it does, even if they don't in that instant suddenly feel like, oh, good, then I can go on and everything's fine. They do carry that with them. And they do remember those moments of when people showed up in the ways that matter. And so it's actually simpler to do than we expect, but harder to do than what we're accustomed to, because we are all kind of, in a very kind of socially adaptive way, we're accustomed to kind of being on autopilot. One of my friends and colleagues, Ashanti Branchi, does this wonderful workshop with boys and men that just is life-changing. And in like 45 minutes, it's with the Ever Forward Club, but in 45 minutes, he makes people feel seen. He makes them feel joined. And it's simply partly because of the way that he shows up. And he shows up with all heart and all vulnerability. And he's just honest, and he welcomes them to be present in that way too. And when I used to invite him into my classes, I'd get all these, big college boys, some of them on the football team, lining up after his workshop because they just need to hug him. They need to, and then they would tell me afterwards, I just have not I've never seen any of the men in my life show up in that way. And it's not to say they don't love the men in their lives, but they recognize that it is very, very hard for men to do that. That's an incredible act of courage to really be present. And so, again, they get it. They know this. I feel like as a society, we tend to underestimate boys and men. And my work really highlights their relational strengths, which means like what they're capable of knowing and doing and how they're capable of showing up in their relationships. Because of course, they're human. And of course, there are things, about them, like about everyone that we can really relate to instantly if we create the space for that to happen.
You're right, because we are all humans with wounds. And when we see each other that way and we can be compassionate and empathetic, then we can be a catalyst for healing for others when we allow them to be who they are. And
right.
Oh my gosh, we don't want to be robots.
Right. It doesn't serve us well. It might serve us and it might be self-protective in certain situations. And there certainly are situations. I mean, I would never tell anyone to like make themselves vulnerable when they can perceive a hostile environment. I would never ask anyone to put themselves in harm's way. But, although those can be kind of temporary strategies for self-preservation, in the long run, if we do that all the time, in every relationship and situation, it's a very isolating and lonely experience. And that also doesn't serve us well. So.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this is, I see we're coming to the end of the hour and I'm going to be processing this all night. This is just incredible wisdom that you've given us, and to be mindful. I mean, that we are all on this journey, and kindness. I mean, this is the main thing that I got out of it is kindness and listening. It's very simple, right? It's basic human needs that's already there. We're going to connect back to who we were when we were born. And that is the essence of it. I mean, that's purity, and we all are pure. It's calling ourselves back into that purity.
Right. I think it's interesting. I don't know if you ever saw that documentary that came out in 2019 on like, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it's about Mr. Rogers. I know I keep mentioning him, and one of the reasons like the general public, people who didn't love him, dismissed him was like, oh, well, it's so simplistic. And I'm like, it's simple, but it's very hard to do, and to really genuinely accept yourself and to accept other people as they are so that we can each discover what our unique talents and contributions will be. That would be tremendous if we could get there. If we could solve that, I think we would alleviate, not necessarily eliminate, but we would alleviate a lot of the struggles that people have, what I call unnecessary obstacles that we've thrown in their way. As I mentioned, life is challenging as it is. We're always going to have, struggles regardless of, just because that's just how life works, but can we remove some of the unnecessary struggles or reduce the unnecessary struggles and remove the unnecessary obstacles so that people can just do the best they can without having others, throw challenges in their way. that wasn't very eloquent, but I think you know what I mean.
I loved it. I loved it. But that's great because we're not trying to be perfect here. So you did it. I'm glad. So Judy, where can people reach you, or where can they find out about your work?
I have a website. I think it's Judy Y Chu. So JUDYYCHU at WordPress. Or if you just Google my name, like Judy Chu and then Boys. There are some previous podcasts I've been on, and sometimes some publications or things like that. But that's probably the easiest way. I'm not on social media, so but I'm on LinkedIn. And there's just so that's one way to reach me, or that's probably the best way to reach me.
All right, yes, and I have information in the also in the description. So
Okay.
Thank you so much for your wisdom and the work you're doing, and together we're all going to work on being a safe space for all of humanity. I feel it.
Thank you so much to all of you who added questions and comments in the chat. I really appreciated those. So.
Yes, thank you, JJ and Frank, and everyone watching on the replay. And make sure you get Judy's books. I mean, I'll try to show it again. This one, When Boys Become Boys. So yeah, we'll all keep up the good work of humanity. So thank you, Judy, and
thank you.
All right, bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for watching.